At a time when India's growth is rapidly evolving into possibly the third largest GDP very soon, if the politicians are to be believed, of course, crossing UK to becoming the fifth largest. But how secular is this growth? How equitable is this growth? How sustainable is this growth? Well, that's, of course, an issue that is hotly debated. Do we really need to have a rethink and relook at the way India is progressing at this point of time, the economic policies that we are following at this point of time? Well, it seems that there needs to be a relook, because Dr. Rajan and Dr. Lamba have come up with a book called Breaking the Mould, Reimagining India's Economic Future. The point that we want to discuss on Deshbhakt today is, who wants to reimagine this future? Is anybody willing to reimagine this future? Or are we in an India where I think we are absolutely happy with the way things are? There really needs to be no reimagination at this point of time. Dr. Rajan and Rohit, and I'm going to say Rohit, I'm sorry, because Rohit and I happen to be contemporaries from Delhi University. I'll get to that in just a bit. But before we start this discussion, Dr. Rajan, I just want you to introduce yourself with the locus of why we need a reimagination and why should people listen to you? Because at this point of time, I think in the euphoria that we are in, there is a general consensus that things are going absolutely fine. There is no need for any reimagination.
Right. So who am I? I'm a professor at the University of Chicago. Been there for close to 30 years or over 30 years. And I have a lot of former titles, Governor of the RBI, Chief Economic Advisor to the government, Vice Chairman of the Bank of International Settlements, Chief Economist, IMF. You can do the Abhivadye. Why am I in any position to talk? Well, I certainly have followed the Indian economy, both as somebody involved in the, quote-unquote running of the economy, but also from bottom up, as a student and through the many visits I pay to the economy. But I've also seen a lot of other countries in the world as chief economist of the IMF and as general economist who's advised various governments across the world. So I think I have some standing to sort of think about where India is going and ask whether we're doing everything that is necessary to sort of go on that plane with all of us want, which is, reach development fast, grow rich before we grow old as a country.
Yep.
And the Prime Minister has said 2047 we want to be a developed country. That's a very strong ambition. But how do we do that in 1 decade when even China took 2 decades to reach middle income, which is where they are, 13,000, with the most spectacular growth in history? So is the old path, the path other countries followed, available for us? Or do we have to follow a new path, partly because we don't have the strengths that other countries have, but we also have strengths other countries do not have? How do we focus on our strengths?
So before we start this discussion and go through this imagination bit and understand where we really need to take a look at, I want to address the elephant in the room. Because when Dr. Rajan says anything today, it will obviously be taken as something which is a counterpoint to the government, because there is politics that is involved, because you may have a different political point of view. When I look at this book, should I view it as your economic point of view, or is there politics? Because your name will be associated with the politics of it, whether be the association with Bharat Jodo Yatra or you interviewing Rahul Gandhi, there is a politics attached to your economics. How would one want to read this book then?
I think the problem to some extent is when you come to a juncture in society where any kind of counter viewpoint to the narrative is viewed as politics, as opposed to a reasoned, logical viewpoint on what some alternatives might be.
Sure.
And that's important, because a country will grow only if it can debate the various issues. If it's not my way or the highway, that if you are not with the current thinking, you must be a critic, and you must be a critic for political reasons, not because you have actually a valid point of view. And I think the sooner we move away from that, the better, because we really have to embark on a growth path which actually understands what's wrong and what needs fixing.
Sure. So we'll get to that. Rohit, It's very interesting. We happen to be contemporaries from Delhi University. Just take us a little bit through the journey from Delhi University to where you are at this point of time, and having a, of course, major contribution. And of course, there are certain points that you have PLI included. I have read your work. You have a very strong point of view on various issues that we'll discuss. But just take us through a bit of your journey and your locus.
Yeah, as Akash said, and Rohit, it's really actually I've done lots of interviews since the morning, but I was really looking forward to this one. It's a real pleasure to be on your show because I've known, we haven't been in touch, but I've known Akash for so many years, and in many ways, he was a super senior of ours and looked up to him. He was this spectacular public speaker, and I'm very happy to say that a lot of public speaking I learned growing up in college was from Akash. We all kind of looked up to when Akash would go on stage and speak, and he's being artificially humble right now. But
No.
But really, so I was really looking forward to this show. So after college, I went to Delhi School of Economics to do a master's. I was a math major, so there's a joke that most failed mathematicians become economists. So then I went on to do a PhD at Princeton, and while I was at Princeton, I read the news that Professor Raghuram Rajan had decided to go back to India and become the chief economic advisor. And in the naivete of youth, I shot him an email saying, I am a PhD student and I want to come work with you. And I think he was very confused, and he's like, you haven't finished your PhD and you want to come work, and he got some kind of reference from my advisor, and he said, okay, yeah, you seem like a guy who wants to contribute. And so I came back and worked with a year with him.
Free of charge,
on national duty. And then Raghu went on to the RBI, and I went back, finished my PhD, and kind of chose the academic life. I think at that time I was a bit torn between whether I wanted to go into some kind of industry or an organization like the IMF and so on. But I think actually working with Raghu really kind of reinforced my belief that academia was the right route for me, because I think there is, it was very exciting with the thought of living in the realm of ideas was very exciting.
Sure.
And so from then on, just usual kind of publish and perish pressures of academia, but which I've really enjoyed. And then actually we had kept in touch since then. It was during COVID actually that we started very seriously talking about Indian economic policy, going back and forth. We had discussions with a wide variety of people. People had time then because everybody was at home and Zooming. And then slowly that converted into, as you were saying, our writings on various subjects in the Times of India in the form of op-eds, including on the PLI. And then, it seemed natural at that point in time to consolidate those ideas, expand them into a book.
So I'll get to the book and I'll break down the chapters that you have talked about and all the important issues. But before that, as I said, Dr. Rajan, in the beginning also, first we have to establish the need for this reimagination. I think that premise needs to be set absolutely loud and clear. Do you think, I interviewed Dr. Abhijit Banerjee immediately after he got his Nobel, and I was just trying to poke him on GDP predictions of economists, and he, in all honesty, said, listen, economists don't really know too much about GDP. They can't really predict GDP. You got yourself into a bit of a controversy also when you said we might be lucky if we cross.
We will be lucky.
We will be lucky, and we've turned lucky and crossed that 5% threshold. So when we say that things are not going proper, we need to do better, this will not shape up, then you get tagged as being doomsday, negative. So how does one trust an economist today that no, this is not right and this is right? How do I trust a writing, a book, or a model that is being projected?
It's a great question, and it's a very valid one, right? And Abhijit is exactly right when he says economists are terrible at predicting the future in the short run. What is next quarter's growth? I mean, give you an example. JP Morgan, at the same time as I said, we'll be lucky to hit 5%, their target was 5%. Their economist is, in my view, the best economist on India living at this point. I mean, practical economist, not sort of academic economist. He's on the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. And they steadily over the year up their growth forecast to 6.5%. Why are people upping their forecast? Because the world is doing much more strongly. Nobody expected the US to grow at 5% last quarter. The projection for the US was 1% at the beginning of the year. So what has happened? Good things have happened. When I said lucky, luck has happened. The global economy has grown much faster than it was expected to grow at the beginning of the year. Because China hasn't done well, commodity prices have stayed low. That is often a headwind to our growth. But also, we shouldn't take away from the fact that the government has spent enormously on infrastructure in the last couple of quarters. It's trying to sort of use infrastructure to compensate. So, absolutely, if you are going to stake your life on an economist's last growth forecast for the next quarter, it's almost surely going to be off. Even the government, and this is the point I want to make, government in 2019, pre-pandemic, so pandemic blew up all the forecasts. It was just impossible to forecast. Pre-pandemic, in the middle of the year, it says we're going to grow at 5%. What was the actual growth for the year? 3.7%. So it missed by a large amount. These are Sarkari economists who know the Sarkari data. So missing forecasts is part of the trait of this thing. That is not my occupation, right? My occupation is about looking at the medium term and thinking about what we need to do above that. So if you want to talk about trust, read the arguments and convince yourself whether they're right or wrong. Every one of these arguments can be challenged. But the point is to delve deeper than the shallowness of you missed the forecast, therefore you must be a Nakli economist, which is what is a concerted, campaign.
The words used were much worse than Nakli economists, but anyways.
Yeah, absolutely. But what I'm saying is this is the shallowness of the arguments, but it is also an organized effort because everybody knows this particular clip.
Okay.
And the point I'm trying to make is engage with the ideas.
Not the identity.
Don't keep focusing on identity and saying, oh, let's talk about ideas. I'm happy to do that.
So my final question before we jump into the ideas and the chapters, and we're talking about processes, education, healthcare, there's a bit of media also. Rohit and Dr. Rajan, both, first you. Before we go into the reimagination, tell me one or two things that have been imagined or reimagined very well over the last 10 years. Something as an economist that you're very happy with the way things have gone in the country. Of course, things are not right. A lot of things are, and we'll get to that. But the positive imagination.
I think one of the greatest achievements of the government has been a systematic, concerted implementation of infrastructure rollout. I think the fact that roads have been built at a certain pace, ports have been upgraded, rural loads have been paid attention to, or even local infrastructure. In one of the economic surveys when I was helping the government write, we called it private provision of public provision of private goods, the toilets, bank accounts. This is also some kind of infrastructure that has been built all over the country. And to the government's credit in a country, and we write this in the introduction, where implementation has lagged.
Yeah.
Right? They have shown that whenever it is done with a seriousness of purpose, it can be implemented. There are obviously problems, have the toilets been followed up, and so we can get into that. But at a level of executing certain implementation infrastructure plans has been very, very good. Okay. I think the second, of course, is digital infrastructure, which Raghu was very much involved in when he was the RBI governor in deciding, for example, the fintech stuff that's now omnipresent. Should payments be limited to banks, or should non-banking institutions be allowed to partake in platforms like what Paytm and PhonePe are doing right now? And today, 95% of all transactions going digitally are non-bank, right? And the government's push towards more digital inclusion has been very commendable.
Dr. Rajan?
Well, let's start with UPI. Great success. Certainly, success has many fathers. I want to claim a little bit of parenthood. It started in my time at the RBI. Now we're at 10 billion transactions a month. As Rohit said, one of the important sort of structural features in that was we let the non-banks in. And that was an important contribution. I think that's one example. I think the broader sort of landmark implementations I think when you look at GST, so much was said about we need it. It was opposed during the UPA time by some of the very people who implemented it. We finally implemented it. I think now we're seeing some of the benefits. The implementation initially was uneven. Now we're seeing the benefits. I think in the longer run, a unified country will be extremely good. And it's very good and commendable this government brought in the goods and services tax.
So if we do not reimagine at this point of time, of course there is a growth and one has to change with the times, and of course the reimagination needs to keep happening, which may not be happening at this point of time because maybe we might have become complacent at some level. But just paint us a picture. Anyways, the allegation is always there, oh, doomsday. Paint us a picture of what happens if we don't listen to all quarters, if we do not reimagine and let things continue the way they are.
Let me give you just some plain simple numbers, right? We have ministers saying we'll become a 5 trillion economy in the next 2 years. Just doing the simple math says that's impossible. But let's take our 6% growth, which is about where our potential is, okay? At 6% growth, it takes you about 12 years to double your GDP. Okay? So take 12 years to double your GDP, takes another 12 years, 24 years, we become 4 times our size. Okay? 24 years from now is 2047. Right? We become 4 times our size. A per capita GDP is 2,500. We will become a $10,000 economy by 2047. Still behind China. In fact, $3,000 per capita behind China. So what are we talking about when we see we become a developed country? By 2047, we cannot do so at this pace of growth. At best, we reach lower middle income to moderate middle income. To go further, we are saying there's a possibility of becoming developed. But for that, we have to skip the process that other countries used. And it's very important to think about that because there is a danger. Despite all the talk of young population, we have a young population, but we will also grow fast. Look at southern India today. They're not even having enough children to replace the population. That means we're going to age, especially in the richer parts of India, we're going to age really fast. How do we grow rich before we grow old? That is going to be an important question, maybe not for me, but certainly for your generation and the generations afterwards. And how do we do that is going to be central. It's not just how do we become developed, but how do we become sufficiently wealthy before we grow old?
So one of the things that has been talked and discussed a lot about what you guys have written, and I quote, as we move towards the China model and become more authoritarian, we're giving up on our great strength that going by very valuable for the 21st century that we built on the ideas industry, brain-based industry rather than brawn-based industry. Now, you're writing this at a time when I think the value for brain itself is under question. It's all about strength in numbers and strength in majority and brute force, and we will make industries. Make in India will also be based on strength. Are you therefore saying that basically this whole thing about brawn is misplaced and the brain is actually the one that we should be focusing on, which is questionable, including education institutions?
I think there's a balance. One can have an informed academic debate about, should India have been democratic? Couldn't we have aped the East Asian miracle model if we were not democratic and so on? And it's a debate worth having. We're looking towards the future and we think that now, given where we are as a democratic country, as a country which is, kind of leading the pack in some sense in services-led development, do we really want to turn the bus? Both in the on all 3 dimensions, politics, society, and economics, because the combination kind of decides the path that we take. Do we really want to do that? And I think brawn is essential. Like as just we discussed, we commended the government in just physical infrastructure. Yeah. But I think a lot of growth, the path that we are suggesting, a large part of it is going to come from intellectual capital now, like training our workforce better. Do you really expect, so even the last National Family Health Survey, for example, says that 35% of our children are still malnourished. There is very good evidence in economics and in other literatures to show that if a child doesn't develop their cognitive and physical abilities till the age of 5, it is very difficult to develop afterwards in certain dimensions. So when you quote us on that, what we're trying to say is that there are limits to what brawn can do. And I think we are hitting or will soon hit the limits. And what we really need to focus on is human capital of our people.
And human capital also means that those kids today who are malnutritioned will not be able to function as sensible adults because their brains are stunted, their body growth is stunted, they have much more disease. Think of it, 35% of your kids are that way. 24 years from now, when we hit 2047, those kids will be 35% of the workforce if we don't make changes today. How can you be a developed country when 35% of your workforce can't? Forget Braun. Their physical capabilities are also limited. Forget their mental capability.
Do you think that there's recognition of this fact? Is anybody recognizing this fact? I'm not even saying solving it.
I think we have recognized as a country that we are doing poorly on malnutrition, but it's hidden under the carpet as something shameful. We should bring it out as something shameful and tackle it at a, what they call mission mode level, and say, measure us. Every year we're going to bring it down until it comes to zero in the next 5 years. It's a tackleable, it's a fixable problem. But these levels, remember, Kerala is 6%. Some places in Bihar and Jharkhand are worse than 35%. So there's a wide disparity in India. We can learn from the best even in India. 6% is the OECD levels. So we have, and this is again and again in the Indian economy, parts of the Indian economy are first world. When you talk about people in Noida or Gurgaon, they are operating in essentially a first world economy. Parts of India are worse than third world, worse than sub-Saharan Africa. And how do we make sure that all of India comes up? Because that is the need of 2047.
And I'm just saying is that some of your points when you're talking about that, listen, this whole, I honestly used to believe that Make in India is a very good idea. It is, I guess, a very good idea. But the suggestion that you're making is just Make in India with just the numbers, low value is not going to work. Now, is that going to find acceptance? Is because the government really has gone ahead and hammer in tongs and said, we will manufacture, lowest cost manufacture, world will come and manufacture you. You're saying that time has passed right now.
We are saying we're competing for the lowest end of the value chain. Instead, we already occupy some higher parts of the value chain. As we say in the book, quoting some sources, 20% of chip design is done in India. That's a high part of the value chain.
But then I can argue that, listen, first you do low value, then you go high value. Why are you wanting to jump?
That is, you've hit the nail on the head. Why do we need to do low value in order to get to the higher value? Because there is no connection. The globe has split up every part of the value chain. Just because you do that low value added doesn't mean you automatically get the high value added, and vice versa. Actually, there's more chance when you capture the high value added, you can get the low value added. Take two examples. Apple. Apple does Apple has done no manufacturing since 2004. All outsourced to Foxconn. Foxconn does the manufacturing. Apple occupies the high part of the value chain. That's the patents, the intellectual property, the design, etc. on the beginning part, and on the end part, the marketing, the finance, the iTunes content, right? So they occupy the plateau. In the valley is Foxconn. Apple's value is 3 trillion, Foxconn's value is 50 billion. Why are we fighting Foxconn to bring that manufacturing to India when we already have people who are doing some of this? Now, what we need to think about is how do we become an Apple rather than a service provider for Apple, right? How do we bring those really smart Indians in India and outside to start product-based companies?
You are saying this at a time when we are exporting talent to the world at record numbers.
7.5 lakh students
just
in 2022.
Just in 2022. Yeah. So, and it's only going to rise.
So if you're thinking of import substitution, think about import substitution which preserves our brains. How do we create strong universities that keep these kids here? Because once we export them to do undergrads there, they're gone. And they are, some of them are going because they can't find good universities to get into here because the supply, those universities are already full of people who earned 100% in their high school exam. But some of them are basically people who we could keep if we created good universities. I've been working on starting a university which is strong in India. And it is really tough to do it. Why can't we make it easier? Because these are the factories of the future. If we retain those kids in India and we teach them at a high quality and then send them abroad to get PhDs and bring them back
Something
to teach
like
the
China
other
has
kids.
done, apparently.
Absolutely.
On a mission mode, they have done. Yeah. You know, on this is a really interesting thing you said about this fetishization, right? Like I don't think I've ever seen, you know, Tim Cook sit down and say, you know, here is the phone. It's, you know, where was it designed or where was it made? I think we've had people from India go to international conferences and say, see, this phone was made in India. If you buy you know, an Apple product today, they actually say designed in California, right? The way, just telling you the way in which the world has changed. We shouldn't be fetishizing, being obsessed with something that is assembled in India. You know, to give you an example that we give in the book, about 1/5 of all chip design is actually happening in India. It's just that it is happening with companies that do not hold the intellectual property in India. They're all American companies. They all are designing chips and outsourcing the work to India. So we already have the talent to design chips. Is it necessary also to fabricate chips in India? Fabrication is actually the putting together of the chips, which costs a lot of money. So to give you an akra that we have in the book, we are trying to set up a fabrication plant in Gujarat. Great, there's nothing wrong in the idea per se. You know, we want to get manufacturing of chips to India. The money, that is subsidy that is required, Micron is the company that is coming to India, and it's a private company. The amount of money we are shelling out from our pocket, the central and state government put together, is 16,500 crores to generate about 5,000 jobs.
Yeah.
India's entire higher education budget, okay, from the central government. What are we talking? All the IITs, all the IIMs, TIFR, Indian Institute of Science, all central university, Delhi University that we went to, all of that budget last year was 44,000 crores. So you're spending more than 1/3 of your entire central university's budget into setting up a plant. It's not it's not a bad thing that you want to fabricate chips in India. I'm just giving you
the resource allocation.
1/5 is already designing the chips, right? This is, you're not subsidizing it, right? This is just sheer talent that India is producing on its own.
What if I were to contest that this is being done so that an example is set and a message is sent out to the world, and this is an advertising cost for me, and maybe in future others will follow after looking at this example?
These chip manufacturers are going to every government and saying, how much will you subsidize me to come here? Germany is spending tens of billions of dollars. Now, remember, what we're getting is memory chips, not logic chips. Logic chips is the brain of the chip. So we're not even at the high end of the chip, we are at a different level of the chip. Germany is trying to subsidize Intel to come to Germany, trying to subsidize other chip manufacturers. It costs north of $10 billion a plant to subsidize that. The US with its CHIPS Act is putting $50 billion. So the immediate answer is, oh, they're also subsidizing, why don't we subsidize? But they're jumping off the cliff. Why do we want to jump off the cliff? Chips, because of all these subsidies, will be plentifully available. Don't focus on the chip. Just because you have that chip manufacturing doesn't mean you're independent in any way. You'll have to import machines from ASML. You'll have to import wafers from across the world. You will not be independent. All you'll have is a very expensive chip manufacturing plant. That tens of billions of dollars can be used much more efficiently in building 100 top universities.
Yeah.
We don't have one university in the top 100, not one. Let's create the patent factories, the ones that create the intellectual property, rather than, you know, we often have this phrase, "Hazar saal ki gulami." That's exactly what we're doing on manufacturing. Going to the lowest end, as one of the entrepreneurs we talked to said, why are we becoming serfs to the rest of the world? We should be the lords, generating that intellectual property. What do we need to do that? That's what we should be thinking of for the next 20 years.
So, in just the final word on manufacturing, I understand the fact that we should be going towards the higher end of the value chain. Would you then say that the way that we had conceived Make in India has to radically be reimagined, and that at least is a failure?
I would very
the Make in India that we have now.
Look, I'm willing to give the scheme the benefit of doubt. But I would say, before you roll it out, in such a big way, see if it works. Are we actually getting people to go beyond the stage of assembly? Remember, with the Nokia factory in India, which was closed in 2011-12, we actually were doing assembly of cell phones. So we were doing it then. Have we moved any far beyond that? Oh yes, we do manufacture the shell today. Oh, chalo, wo aluminum shell bana rahe hain. But are we making serious components? And is that, do we need to subsidize to keep moving up? Apple will come here because we are a big market and Apple needs alternatives to China. So it will come here. But the question is, do we need to subsidize them hugely?
Have we been successful in being an alternative to China?
Not as much as we should. The immediate ports of call are Mexico and Vietnam. We have got much less, by some of the estimates we've seen, of the China plus one flows. We should try and encourage more people to set up. Some of what we need to do is the old stuff. Make it easier to do business in India, make it easier to acquire land, etc. We didn't want to repeat the old stuff in this book. Everybody knows what has to be done there. And some state governments are actually doing what it takes. Even the central government, with its infrastructure build out, is creating a better environment to manufacture. What we're questioning is where the investment of resources is going. Should we be improving Indian minds, or should we be subsidizing Micron?
Sure, that point is taken well. What I was finding it very ironical is the decentralization argument that is being made, and that it should really become more decentralized. And that comes at a time when we've had the Supreme Court also uphold the fact that no, the central government can actually go ahead and, declare a state into a union territory, and the shift definitely is towards more centralization. So I find it very ironical is a lot of solutions mentioned in the book are actually diametrically opposite to the political thinking of our times, which is one nation, one election, one nation, one party, one nation, one leader. So how does decentralization then, how would you explain it to a layman that no, it's not about running a country from the national capital, it's actually running the country from the villages. It's an argument, it's an age-old argument, and I think we're unfortunately going the other way.
See, we mentioned in the book that it is a topic that the Constituent Assembly thought about a lot, debated about a lot, okay? And I think there was a reason, and in retrospect, a valid reason to why we created a centralized governance system. What was the valid reason was that, we had a big worry, of what Vallabhbhai Patel did, was to bring the country together. And at that time, keeping the country together was paramount, was the most important thing. And especially in the aftermath of the partition, there were genuine insecurities about how would we keep this country together. And so a centralized governance system was envisioned. We think that this problem has largely been solved. We feel together, broadly speaking, India feels like a country that is put together for a variety of reasons that we mentioned in the book. And so now governance must trump other insecurities, efficiency of governance. And there is a large amount of historical evidence to show that governance is most effective, especially in the service of public goods such as health and education, when you decentralize. Just to give you a context, right? Like to contrasting examples of Delhi and let's say Uttar Pradesh, UP is the 5th largest country in the world. Okay, there are 250 million people in the UP. Now, do you really think UP can be governed from Lucknow? We are sitting in UP right now,
yes.
So just to keep this in mind, what is one thing that we mentioned in the book, which is kind of very heartwarming, appreciative about what the Delhi government has done, is that it has put health and education at the front and center of electoral politics. And so what is interesting, we cover the Mohalla clinics and the schools in Delhi, and why we think our research and talking to a lot of people found out is that why it is easier to do these things in Delhi vis-a-vis, let's say, the entire state of Uttar Pradesh, is because not in terms of just in terms of the number of people, but just in terms of the physical distance you cover. Delhi is a very small place, and the number of schools, there's thousands of government schools. So you can actually monitor and get feedback very easily. So what we're trying to argue is that one of the reasons why they were able to do the Mohalla clinics and clean up the schools and get more teacher accountability was because the chain of accountability all the way from the parents to the teachers to the people in charge was very short. This is what decentralization does. It gives immediate feedback, bottom-up feedback into governance. what decentralization also allows you to do is experimentation. So let's not forget some of the most successful schemes that that are prevalent today in India, including Manrega, including midday meal scheme, which was very, very successful in getting people to school, started off as small experiments in different states. These successful learning lessons in Narega in Maharashtra, midday meal scheme in the south, and so eventually they were scaled up to the entire country through learnings that we had, knowledge that was shared about what is working, what is not working, and so on. Just in terms of sheer size, even a district in India is a very large entity. So how can you possibly govern India at this point in time? You can do transfers. You can provide direct transfers. You can do all those sorts of things in a centralized way. But to improve governance, to improve health and education, you need to decentralize.
Plus, what you mentioned, it doesn't need to be either or. It can be both. There are some policies which have to be at the center. Defense, for example. No way that you can decentralize defense.
Sure.
But, emissions. You have to have a common car emission for the country. You can't have every state having its different emission requirement. But on the other hand, when you're talking about health and education, you're talking about police services. Every municipality in the US has its own police force because that creates accountability to the local people. So I think we need to, it's high time we explored this. Now, the problem, of course, when you say centralization is it doesn't just mean centralization to Delhi. It often means centralization within the government itself to a narrow coterie, maybe the Prime Minister's office and so on. And our country is too big to be governed by such a narrow set of players.
Sure. When we're talking about India and the growth story, there are so many facets that remain hidden perhaps. Is there a very clear danger, for example, of deindustrialization at this point of time? That are we seeing rapid rise as far as people going back to agriculture, manufacturing to GDP ratio getting stagnant at this point of time? If so, why are these numbers not more widely discussed or worried upon or focused on?
So I think pre-pandemic we saw the rise of agricultural employment, which shocked us. How can you have a growing nation, especially the numbers you quoted, with agricultural employment growing? I mean, the whole point is to get people out of agriculture into services and industry, right? True. So that was astonishing. This was pre-pandemic. Of course, during the pandemic, a lot of people went back to their villages because they couldn't find the safety net in the cities. And that hasn't fully come back either. So, this is a source of concern. That said, I would say what we need to create is the environment for jobs, whether it's services, whether it's manufacturing, whether it's something else, so long as good jobs. It can be even agri-related industries or value-added agriculture. But we need to create that environment. We need to create the basis for that. One important study, for example, comparing China and India, basically says what was the difference between Chinese liberalization and Indian? Workers in China were much more educated at the time of liberalization. Okay. So that worker could start a small enterprise on his own because he knew how to do the basic accounting, the basic business. And so you had this flourishing of enterprise, the town and village enterprises you've heard of. Many of the big tycoons in China today started off, with really nothing and built on it. So some modicum of education is necessary for anything. And what we need to ask ourselves is, do we have enough of that? As we keep saying, when we talk to manufacturers, they say we can't find workers. So how come you can't find workers in India? India has so many people. We can't find well-trained workers in our country. And that, I think, should worry us, should shock us. Because if we can't find workers, why are we inviting these businesses in? Because, ultimately the idea is to get jobs for people. I think flip it over. Instead of inviting the businesses, create the workers. Once you create the skilled workers, the businesses will come.
So then what then explains the fact that there is such a widespread issue of jobs, industrialization, make in India, but the numbers continue to show that the economy is growing? Ultimately, I can turn back at you and say that you are just being negative at this point of time. The economy is growing. We are the third largest. International Monetary Fund is saying that we are going to be third largest very soon. How do you then do the maths there and explain?
I think these facts are not at odds. India is growing, and one of the things about not being a very large, not having a very high per capita income is that catch-up growth is much easier. So India will grow. It will continue to grow. There's no doubt about it. Can you grow fast enough, at a pace fast enough that you become rich before you become old? That's the question. And I don't think it is hidden from anyone. I mean, I'm sure all of us followed the recent state elections. It is not hidden from anyone that the sabse bada mudda hai, the top issue worrying people is both the quality and the quantity of jobs. So yes, we are growing, but if we were growing that well, and if we were generating jobs at a breakneck speed, which is what is required, jobs won't be an issue. Why are people clashing in Manipur?
You see disquiet over jobs.
So okay, that's
Manipur is...
It's about reservations. Reservations is fundamentally about jobs.
Okay, let's go case by case. So it's a very important question, right? So we remember the protests that came up when the military changed the hiring strategy for Agniveer, right? Why were so many people protesting? Why was there violence when the scam was discovered in railway recruitment? Right? Because it matters so much, right? And for a country with the promise that India has, right? And the size of India, for so many millions of our youth to put all their aspirations in government jobs, which are very limited, is actually very sad. It tells you that the greatest entrepreneurial spirit of the economy, which is in the private sector, is simply not being able to generate enough secure and stable jobs. Why do people want to have government jobs because of the stability attached to it? We are not being able to produce those kind of jobs in the private sector, and this tells you that the growth, both in its quality and quantity, is simply not enough.
Dr. Rajan, do you think that there can be this sort of reimagination unless and until the public really wants for it? There was a push come to shove in 1991, last minute resort, then we opened up. Are we going to wait till something like that happens?
I hope not. I mean, the whole point of sensible thinking, hopefully, is to try and alert people. These are the ways that we need to change. And it doesn't take a jobs crisis or heavy social conflict for us to make that change. I mean, what we're hoping, this is as much aimed as the leaders of our country as the ordinary people. And we're trying to say, look, let's try and make an assessment. What's going right? What's going wrong? And, certainly if you do that assessment properly, you will see that there is need for some change. Even if we are to achieve those aspirations we talked about, of becoming developed by 2047. The current pace will simply not cut it.
Or are we doing aspirations in a very short-circuited way and giving quote-unquote Revdi versus welfare? Now, this is a debate I want both of you to answer for me, is because there is so much of confusion over doing welfare for people, allowing them to grow versus giving them electoral Revdis. So when you have, okay, let's go with free transportation in the national capital, Revdi or welfare?
Depends on whether it's for women or for men.
Women.
Free transportation for women below a certain income level, absolutely. How do you target? That's the question. If you cannot target at all, sometimes you have to weigh the pros and cons of universal versus targeting. If you can target, I would say below a certain income, you should, because that's a way for them to go securely to work.
80 crore people on food subsidy, Revdi or welfare?
During the pandemic, welfare.
Yes.
After the pandemic, converging to Revdi.
Okay. Free mixies, very common in southern states before elections. Apparently, that has helped housewives save enough amount of time for other productive purposes.
So let me give you a different example, right? Because we can debate free mixies, but sometimes subsidizing cooking gas may be for the lower income people again. Again, targeting is quite important. Okay. May be a good thing because the alternative is to grab firewood from different places. It's dangerous to go out to get the firewood sometimes, and then you're also emitting, doing the firewood. Correct. You're also creating health problems within the hut or within this thing with that. So cooking gas can be a good thing for the housewife, both in terms of health, but again, targeted. Why should everybody have this subsidy? The better you can target all these, the more it becomes welfare. The less you target it, the more it becomes populist.
Okay, since we've touched on the word populist, I want to touch on the word politics as well. One of the aspects being mentioned is also democracy. Now, my friend Bhakt Banerjee will come and say that why are you dragging in politics into economics and saying is that, listen, let's talk about economics. Let's not drag politics into it. So, why would you want to say democracy is going to be so important in ensuring reimagination?
I think we are offering a package deal in some sense, right? And you're very right in asking how is politics connected with economics. I think democracy works on 3 levels. One, if you want that free thinking, idea generating, creative economy, the most creative economies across history, look at the span of history, have been the more democratic, open ones. Yes, Soviet Union could do defense properly. China was able to generate ideas, but typically when its private sector was vibrant, as it's cracking down on the private sector, the Chinese academics themselves are saying, look, we are going in the wrong direction because we don't have that creative economy that, for example, the US has. So that's one, creativity. Second, bottom up, we are saying people should be willing to demand the services. Mm-hmm. For that, you should be able to protest. If the protest puts you in jail every time you protest, why are you going to protest? If the teacher's brother-in-law is police inspector and just can shut you up at the moment's notice, saying ki you've committed some crime or the other, we need the ability democratically to protest bottom up. That's important. The third aspect is course correction. When the economy is going wrong and somebody's pointing it out, if you are a democracy, you've got the data, you've got the transparency by which people can make the analysis and say this is going wrong. And the newspapers publish it, the course correction takes place. Mm. If you say, the government can do no wrong, any kind of protest against the government is anti-national, then you can never course correct. And this has happened in within the last, remember when, in 2011-12, we were going off track. Yeah. There was a huge amount of protest that India was slowing down, India was going off track. That helped the government change course. The finance minister was changed, a new finance minister was brought, and from that time we started recovering in growth at that point. So protest has value because it can change the course of government for the path we are suggesting, which is new and different. You need that kind of ability.
Also, every country has its own temperament. I think this we are a vibrant, some may call chaotic, whatever, mission of things, and I think it suits our temperament to be this mix of democratic ethos with an economy that relies on our comparative advantage. And I think a good example of being transparent actually helps in policy making was during COVID, right? If you're counting deaths wrong, right, you will be under this overconfident frame of mind, no matter how good an economist you are, no matter how good a policy maker you are, no matter how good intentions you have. If you're being fed the wrong information, sure, right, what happened during the second wave was arguably fed by a system that was fed by an information machine which was feeding the wrong information to the policy
because we undercounted deaths in the first wave. We were complacent. We thought we were immune to COVID.
And theories about Indians are immune to COVID and
remember those cricket matches where people were breathing down each other's neck, and then we had the second wave, and then we realized we're not immune to COVID. We actually have a problem.
There is so much more to ask as far as this book is also concerned, but so we put out this question, that we have Dr. Raghuram Rajan coming in, and our Discord members were asking questions. Besides the book and issues and economics, the one question that came the most is, do not let him go before he tells you whose idea was demonetization. After so many years, has there been any more clarity over whose idea was it?
I have said that, I think, who was the original whisperer who whispered the idea? I think the scuttlebutt is it came from that operation in Pune, which I don't know the reality. The point is, I've said this again, I was asked by the Prime Minister's office to examine whether it was a good thing or not. And we responded to the Prime Minister's office with a note which laid out the pros and cons of demonetization. I think in my assessment. That note basically said, don't do it.
When you heard about the nano GPS chip being inserted into 2000 rupee note, what was your first reaction?
Actually, I haven't heard of that. What is this nano?
There was this whole thing about a chip being inserted into the 2000 rupee note that will enable it to be tracked. Of course, it was a fake news, but it spread
Yeah,
like
good.
wildfire.
I thought I was out of the loop on this one. No, I just think, so there is a very real question. Why did we print the 2000 rupee note?
Yeah.
That was the fastest way to print enough money to be ready for the kind. So government said, how long will it take to print money? Well, depends on what size note you print, because we had the printing presses working full time. So if we had to print the money, it was going to be fastest doing the 2000 rupee note. Now, of course, I mean, once I checked with my legal team, they said there's no way you can oppose demonetization. You're the RBI, you have to listen to the government. Once that was the case, I couldn't not print the money for fear of what would happen if we demonetized without enough money.
Yeah.
In actual fact, we demonetized without enough money.
Finally, when we are talking about the reimagination of India's economic future, one big aspect of this economic future is the rise of oligarchies that is happening. And there are a lot of defenders who would say, look, you had Shebals also. What's the big deal? Even if 2 or 3 big industrialists come, they are generating employment and they are going to go outside and earn revenue for India. What's your outlook towards few big guys dominating every aspect of the economy?
I think bigness by itself is not a problem. If we have companies in India that are globally competitive, providing employment and services to people both in India and abroad the world, that's not a problem. The problem is when the bigness emanates from closeness to government, and that's the main reason rather than competitiveness because then you are not encouraging the best talent, the best ideas to come to the fore. Infosys came out of nowhere. It was not, it was not something that was generated because of closeness to government and so on.
Yeah.
I think we must acknowledge that it is good that India should have national champions, but they should be built on the premise of ideas, of access to good capital, rather than closeness.
They should
to
be
government.
competitive.
They should be globally competitive.
They should rise because of their competitiveness rather than their proximity to government.
My final question to both of you then. Do you think that there is enough awareness amongst the public for a reimagination to take place at this point of time? Can this reimagination happen without the public's insistence?
I mean, we are trying to persuade the public. And what we are trying to do is start a debate. Ideas start with a debate. Debate may take a long time. We are not saying that overnight people will become convinced. We're saying throw this out. Let people start talking. And hopefully over time, there will be a realization we need to do more.
Dr. Rajan, many thanks for joining us here. Rohit, really a pleasure. I wish we could have this conversation go on. Breaking the Mould, Reimagining India's Economic Future. A lot of controversial ideas because, well, a lot of ideas really need a complete U-turn in rethink. Have a look at it. As Dr. Rajan says, let's at least have a debate.